They were buried alive, sealed in absolute darkness, their hands tied, left to suffocate in the foundations of a god's house. In 2021, at the Luxor temple, archaeologists broke through a wall and found them. 13 girls, ages 12 to 16. And listen to me, that discovery, it wasn't a tragedy, it was a system, and the fate of these 13 was the least horrifying part of what was done to Egypt's so-called temple virgins. They were buried alive, sealed in absolute darkness, their hands tied, left to suffocate in the foundations of a god's house. In 2021, at the Luxor temple, archaeologists broke through a wall and found them. 13 girls, ages 12 to 16. And listen to me, that discovery, it wasn't a tragedy, it was a system, and the fate of these 13 was the least horrifying part of what was done to Egypt's so-called temple virgins. Forget the golden masks, the grand pyramids, the Cleopatra you think you know. The truth is darker, far darker, and I'm about to show you 3 things that will shatter the ancient Egyptian fantasy forever. First, the brutal selection process. A calculated machine that ripped girls as young as 6 from their families, and the purity tests that killed dozens before they ever reached the temples. Second, the forbidden rituals archaeologists discovered in a hidden chamber in 2019, carvings that prove these weren't honored priestesses. They were victims. And third, the cold, hard evidence from CT scans and toxicology reports that reveals the monstrous reality behind those sacred temple walls. Hit subscribe right now, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly why this story was buried for 3,000 years. Let's start by dismantling the official story. When you picture Egyptian temples, you think of prayer and piety. But that's a carefully crafted lie. These temples were economic empires, controlling over 20% of Egypt's entire wealth. We're talking vast farmlands, gold mines, and trade routes. The priests who ran them were untouchable, answering to no one. And at the heart of this power structure was a position shrouded in divine light, God's wife of Amun, temple virgins, the ultimate symbol of purity, a bridge to the gods. Noble families supposedly competed for the honor. That's the official record. But between 2015 and 2023, new technology ripped that lie to shreds. Ground-penetrating radar found sealed chambers. CT scanners saw through mummy wrappings to the trauma within, and AI started decoding hieroglyphs that had been deliberately mistranslated for centuries. What they found wasn't honor, it wasn't divine service, it was a meticulously engineered system of control, abuse, and murder hidden in humanity's most sacred spaces. The bones don't lie, and their story starts not in the temple but at home, with the selection process that stole these girls' childhoods before it stole everything else. So let's start at the beginning. The selection process. A calculated nightmare disguised as a divine honor. Imagine you're a nobleman in Thebes. You have 3 daughters, ages 10, 8, and 6. One morning, temple priests arrive at your door. They have armed guards. They've come to inspect your girls. You have no choice. None. Refusal meant execution. Your entire family line erased from history. This isn't speculation. Inscriptions at Karnak Temple explicitly describe the process. The pure ones taken before corruption touches them, delivered to the god's service. Before corruption was their code. They wanted girls aged 6 to 10, young enough to be molded, broken, controlled, and the so-called inspection ceremonies, medical papyri from the New Kingdom, describe them in cold, clinical detail. They were not gentle examinations. These children were stripped naked in front of temple officials and subjected to invasive physical inspections that would be considered sexual assault by any modern standard. But here is what makes this even more sinister. The priests didn't just select one girl. They took dozens from across Egypt every single year. Competition between temples meant they needed a constant fresh supply, and not all of these girls survived the selection. A 2017 study of children's burial sites near Karnak revealed something that chilled archaeologists to the bone. 47 small bodies, all female, aged 6 to 12, all showing clear signs of violent death. The dating placed them all within a single 5-year period. These weren't plague victims. They weren't accidents. The skeletal trauma was consistent with physical abuse. These were the girls who didn't pass inspection or who tried to resist. And their families? Historical records show that families who protested their daughter's selection often vanished from official records entirely. No more tax documents, no property titles, just gone. The message was brutally clear: give us your daughters willingly or lose everything. So these children, some barely old enough to remember their mothers' faces, were torn from their homes and dragged into temple complexes they would never ever leave. Their names were stripped away. They were given new identities as brides of the god. Their families were told to be grateful, honored, proud, but the selection was just the prelude, the opening act of a horror show. Because once these girls passed through those towering stone gates, the priests had absolute control. No witnesses, no oversight, and what they called divine preparation was really something else entirely. In 2018, Egyptian and German researchers performed CT scans on a mummy labeled God's Wife of Amun, Dynasty 21. What they found shocked veteran forensic pathologists. Her bones told a silent, screaming story. 17 separate fractures in her arms, her ribs, her fingers, all healed at different stages. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a disease. This was sustained, repeated physical abuse over years. And she wasn't alone. When researchers expanded the study to 12 of these mummies, they found the same horrific pattern in every single one. Malnutrition markers indicating prolonged starvation. Bone density suggesting severe vitamin D deficiency from a life without sunlight. Growth plate disruptions, their very development deliberately stunted. The priests called it purification. The evidence calls it torture. Temple dietary records describe their so-called purification diet. Watered-down beer, minimal bread, occasional fish. Maybe 800 calories a day for growing children who needed twice that. The goal wasn't nutrition. The goal was weakness, to keep them too frail, too exhausted, to resist. Archaeological surveys of the training quarters reveal windowless cells, barely large enough to lie down in. No natural light, constant disorienting noise from adjacent ritual chambers. This is textbook sensory manipulation, the same techniques modern interrogators classify as torture. But I need you to stay with me, because the physical torture was horrific, but what they did to their minds was so much worse. The physical torture was designed to break their bodies, but what came next was designed to shatter their minds. Toxicology reports from mummified tissue samples revealed a chilling secret. In every single God's Wife mummy tested, researchers found traces of 2 specific compounds: blue lotus extract and mandrake alkaloids. You understand what these are? These are not medicines. These are powerful psychoactive drugs. Blue lotus induces a state of euphoria and deep dissociation. It makes you detached from your own body, from your own reality. Mandrake is a potent deliriant. It causes intense hallucinations, confusion, and a profound state of compliance. Used together, they create the perfect victim, a person who doesn't resist, a child who can be convinced she's experiencing divine visions instead of human abuse. Temple pharmaceutical records coldly state these drugs were administered daily to, and I quote, prepare the vessels for divine union. Let me translate that for you. They were systematically drugging these children to make them compliant, to make them pliable, and yet some of them still tried to escape. The evidence is carved into their very bones. One mummy, a girl of about 13, shows deep, permanent scarring around both wrists, the kind of damage that only comes from being bound so tightly for so long that the bonds cut into flesh and never truly healed. This training period lasted between 2 and 5 years, a relentless campaign to erase the person they once were, breaking their bodies through starvation and pain, breaking their minds through isolation and drugs, breaking their spirits until they truly believed they were no longer human, but divine property. And once they were broken completely, hollowed out and remade into obedient shells, that is when the true, monstrous purpose of this entire system began. Because everything you've heard so far, the selection, the starvation, the drugs, was merely the prelude. It was all just preparation for what the priests actually wanted from them. In 2019, restoration workers at the Dendera temple found something that wasn't meant to be seen, ever. Behind a deliberately plastered wall, hidden for over 2 millennia, was a sealed chamber. And the walls were covered in carvings the priests never ever wanted anyone to find. I cannot show you everything depicted on these walls. This platform would remove this video instantly. But what archaeologists documented were explicit, horrifying depictions of what were called sacred marriage ceremonies. Let me be brutally clear, these were not marriages, they were ritualized sexual assaults. The priests performed these acts while claiming they weren't acting as men, but as vessels of the god. They told these drugged, starved, traumatized children that this was the will of the gods, and this wasn't rare. This wasn't an isolated sin. Papyrus archives from Karnak Temple document over 40 of these sacred union ceremonies performed every single year at that one complex alone. Multiply that across the major temple sites, Luxor, Dendera, Abydos, and we are talking about tens of thousands of these rituals, performed across centuries of Egyptian history. The system was perfectly designed to enable this. High priests answered to no civil authority. Temple grounds were legally inviolate. Even the pharaoh's own guards could not enter without permission, and the gods' wives. They had no voice, no advocates, no way to scream the truth. Because who do you tell when your abuser claims to be a god? Some of these girls, these children, became pregnant. Pelvic examinations of the mummies confirm at least 3 had given birth. One was as young as 14, but the temple records are silent. No mention of these children, no documentation of births, no records of babies. So, where did they go? The answer came in 2020. Ground-penetrating radar found the truth. Clusters of tiny infant remains, in unmarked pits adjacent to temple walls. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, buried quickly, secretly, without a single ceremony. The evidence is undeniable. When these sacred marriages produced children, those children simply disappeared. This wasn't religion. This wasn't spirituality. This was a system of absolute power and absolute control, disguised as holiness. And if you think death was an escape from this nightmare, if you think some of them survived their service, then you are not ready for the final devastating truth, for the girls who resisted, who failed to please, who became inconvenient witnesses. The priests had one final horror in reserve, a fate so dark it was meant to be forgotten in the very stones of Egypt. Remember the 13 skeletons from the beginning, the ones buried alive. Let me tell you what the full excavation report concluded. They weren't just buried near the temple. They were entombed within the foundation walls themselves, and the forensic evidence is irrefutable. They were conscious when they were sealed in. Their bodies were found in positions of frantic struggle, fingers with broken nails, shredded from clawing at unyielding stone, spines twisted, suggesting they tried to curl into a ball to escape the crushing darkness. One skull showed impact fractures from repeatedly beating her head. Against the wall above her, ancient construction. Texts whisper of eternal guardians, human sacrifices placed in foundations to bless the sacred space forever. For centuries, Egyptologists dismissed this as metaphor, a spiritual concept. The 2021 excavation proved it was a literal, brutal practice. Temple records coldly label these victims as failed vessels, girls who resisted the rituals, who refused to comply, who became pregnant and couldn't be discreet. They had become problems, living proof of the temple's rotten core, so they were erased. Buried alive in the very buildings where they had been abused, their silenced screams becoming part of the foundation. But what of the girls who didn't resist? The ones who survived their service? Surely they were eventually freed, allowed to live out their lives. Number temple archives show a god's wife remained temple property until the day she died. Some served for 40, 50 years. They performed their public ceremonial roles, praised by the masses as holy women. But they never left. They never married. They never knew a life outside those walls. They were permanent prisoners. Trapped behind a golden facade of religious honor, this system persisted for over 1,500 years. It only ended when Roman occupation imposed an external authority the Egyptian priests could not manipulate or ignore. And here is a historical irony that will stagger you. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, actually attempted to expose and dismantle these very practices. She pushed for temple reforms, external audits, civil oversight. Ancient historians record that the priesthood violently opposed her. This is a key reason they later betrayed her and sided with Rome. She was a direct threat to their entire system of power, and after Rome took control, the priests began a systematic cover-up. Wall carvings were plastered over. Papyrus records were burned. Deliberate translation errors were introduced into sacred texts. They tried to erase what had happened. They almost succeeded, but they couldn't erase the bones. They couldn't erase the chemical traces in mummified tissue. They couldn't erase the foundations they had built. On top of buried bodies, the evidence waited. For millennia, conservative estimates suggest that between 50,000 and 70,000 girls were consumed by this system throughout Egyptian history. 70,000 stolen childhoods, 70,000 victims whose suffering was branded sacred. And this leads to the uncomfortable modern question. Many Egyptian authorities today resist new excavations in these sacred temple areas. They cite cultural preservation, religious respect, tourism, but some archaeologists whisper another, darker reason, protecting a pristine national image from a truth that is far harder to market than golden masks and pyramid mysteries. This wasn't unique to Egypt. Similar patterns are now being unearthed in Mayan temple complexes, Greek oracle sites across the ancient world. Wherever unchecked power meets divine justification, we find the evidence. The temples still stand. They are monuments to genius, to art, to a culture that reached for the stars, but they are also crime scenes. The burial grounds for victims whose names were erased, whose suffering was called holy, whose abuse was called love. So I leave you with this question. Should we push for the complete excavation of these sites? Should we expose the full, ugly truth, no matter who it offends or what legends it shatters? Or should some secrets remain buried out of respect for modern cultural identity? There is no easy answer, but this conversation matters, because sometimes the gods men created were just masks for monsters, and the scariest part, we are still finding the bodies. If this kind of dark, uncovered history compels you, next week I'm exposing the Aztec flower wars and the terrifying truth behind their captured children. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. The truth is waiting.